Saladin K. Patterson is the executive producer and showrunner of The Wonder Years. And I'm at Noble Gold Derby, and I wanted to ask you, Saladin, what couldn't you help but wonder when you approached this show?
What couldn't I help but wonder when I approached this show? I couldn't help but wonder if an audience was going to be able to embrace a story called The Wonder Years because of how beloved the original was, but a story about a different family, a black family, a black middle class family, and their experiences during that time. I agree with Lee Daniels that that was a perspective we had not seen before, and that it was worth telling because it was a unique perspective in terms of what it meant to be black and middle class at that time, what it meant to be black and middle class during the civil rights movement, and then in this particular case, because they allowed me to make it loosely based on my family, what it meant to be black middle class during the civil rights movement and in the South. So I couldn't help but wonder how it would be embraced, and I have to say I've been very, very pleased with how the audience has really taken this show in and seen it as its own thing, not a reboot, not a rehash, not a remake, but like a reimagining with its own family, with their own agency, with their own storyline, their own drive, separate from the Arnolds in that, but similar in terms of tone and nostalgia and reminiscing and recollecting what it means to come of age.
Well, yeah, and that's a good point, because when you're approaching a reimagining of a sort of classic television series, how much are you trying to sort of emulate, and how much are you trying to sort of innovate?
This is a great question. It's something that we had to really talk about, discuss, and kind of really figure out what it was for us. I was very, very blessed, and I'm very blessed to have Fred Savage as a producing partner in this, since he lived the original and contributed to what the original was. It was something that he and I both took very seriously because neither of us wanted just to rehash what the original did because it did it so well. But having Fred there, we had a lot of discussions about, well, what was it at the heart of the original that made it special, but that also was something that was more universal that we could also tap into and still be our own thing. And what we really landed on, Matt, was just the idea of nostalgia, the magic of growing up, the fact that when you're 12, your father's larger than life, your family's larger than life. And the world exists, no pun intended, in a little bit of black and white when you're that age. There's right, there's wrong, there's good, and there's bad. And what the coming of age experience often is when you are maturing enough to realize that those lines are really blurred, that everything isn't always black or white or good or bad or right or wrong. And as you experience the world in a different way and different perspectives, that's how you kind of wrap your head around that when you are an adolescent. And so we really wanted to tap into all those things, the magic of being 12, but also just the reality of when you start to see the world a little differently. You start to realize your parents are flawed. You start to realize, that everything isn't always going to work out for the good, for good people, And so we really wanted to, I guess I'll say, emulate that, but then through the lens of our specific characters, what it's like to be a 12-year-old black boy who's experiencing these things. There's the commonality of the best friend, first crush, all those sorts of things that are universal. But there's also the specific experience of, living in a society where you and your family should have access to things that other middle class families do, but there's an extra obstacle for your family because of civil rights. So that was the lens that we wanted to interpret everything through. But we certainly wanted to emulate the original in its tone, in its sweetness, in its ability to actually tell stories that have both humor and heart, some drama, some sadness, because that's what real life is, and we really, really wanted, first and foremost, for this show to feel grounded and real for these characters, the same way the original felt grounded and real for the Arnold family.
And you mentioned Fred Savage, who actually directed a number of the episodes, who was the original lead in the old version, the 80s version of the series, which is cool. With that, and I thought an interesting thing in the pilot of this version and the pilot of the old one, some of the characters dealing with loss But in the old version of the show, it's a family member who passed away from the Vietnam War, a cultural touchstone moment. But for this version of the series, this iteration, this reimagining, it is the death of Martin Luther King, which isn't a member of the family, but still has a personal impact. So do you want to talk us through that? That's sort of an area where there was a parallel, but also a big difference there.
Right. So when I was coming up with what the pilot story would be, and again, fully recognizing that the show is called The Wonder Years, and so there's going to be some expectations, rightfully so, in terms of what sorts of things we would tackle, but also keeping in mind that I really wanted to start off by establishing, to really turn people's expectations on their head and say, even if you were expecting something that's going to be like the original, we want to show you that this is going to be something different in our own way. But I certainly did want to lean into the format of the original, like you said, dealing with a pivotal moment in a young man's life, being 12. In the original, it was the beginning of junior high. In ours, it is really the pivotal moment of him being in an integrated school and really seeing himself as a person who can bring his two groups of friends together, for the first time. And we also wanted to show that, in the late 60s, during that, turbulent time for Black and white families, you were always exposed to the possibility and danger of tragedy, whether it be because of war, because of protests, because of civil unrest, or whatever. And so when we wanted to figure out how do we establish the identity of our family as something unique. Now, the Vietnam War affected Black families and white families alike, and we deal with that later. But we wanted to think about something that, whereas everyone could relate to it, would have a specific effect on our family in terms of loss and tragedy, and just the fact that that's all a part of life. You have ups and then you have downs, in the same moment sometimes. And so, there was nothing that I think could resonate more with Black Americans during that time than the death of Martin Luther King Jr. Since we were setting the show in 1968, the same as the original, and that happens to be when Dr. King was assassinated, that felt like an organic thing for us to show our family having to deal with. Because again, what we're trying to show was, on some level, the Black middle class was identical to the white middle class in terms of education, aspirations for your family, wanting safe neighborhoods, wanting safe schools, having upwardly mobile professions, wanting to do things like vacation. On paper, all that's the same. However, the experiences are going to be different because Black Americans had this extra level of things that were going on in society that kept them from that American dream, per se. And so having to deal with the assassination of Dr. King, who represented in so many ways what a Black middle class family had been able to achieve because of sacrifice and civil rights, and have him be assassinated, it was a great way to show how, for a Black family, that foundation can be rocked in a way that necessarily wouldn't apply to a white family.
You mentioned the show set in 1968. I'm wondering, when you were approaching, okay, we're gonna do a new version of the Wonder Years. Were you always gonna have it set in 1968, or was there ever?
Sorry.
No, it's fine. Or was there ever a question about, the last one was made in 1988, 20 years earlier, where we should set this Wonder Years 20 years before the present time as well? Or were you always 1968, that's when we got to go the same year as?
From conception, we were going to set it in 1968 for a few reasons, but that question comes up a lot. Fans ask the question all the time, or the casual observer asks the question all the time. People who aren't necessarily familiar with how TV development works are saying, well, just make it 20 years before, but they're not thinking about the same things that we're thinking about in terms of the opportunity to tell stories, opportunity to make a statement. Because sure, if we went back 20 years, it would have been 2001. And sure, we could have talked about 9/11. That certainly is something that changed the world. But there have been plenty of stories from the points of view of African American families and the middle class families set during those times already. Okay, we had shows that existed in present day on TV during those times to show that perspective. What we had not seen was a Black middle class family perspective from 1968. And again, 1968, the late 60s were such a tumultuous time period that we thought it's beneficial to see. We thought there's a benefit to seeing a Black family's experience then, but we also did not want to run from the parallels between what was going on in our country in 1968 and what was going on in our country in 2019, which is when we first started talking about this, and then on into 2020. There's no way we could have predicted the pandemic, but there was a flu pandemic in 1968. We were developing this before the summer of racial reconciliation and justice after George Floyd. But even in 2019, before that, we still had the same underlying issues that came to a boil because of that, in terms of Black people's treatment by the police, in terms of the political divide that was going on in the country, and the partisanship. All those things were existing already in our present day, and there was more of a parallel between what was going on when we developed this show in 2019 and what was going on in 1968 than there was between 2019 and 2001. And we thought it was an opportunity to at least be able to shine a light on what we were experiencing present day by looking at the past and showing the parallels and how we overcame those things in the past. So there were a lot more creative reasons to set it in 68, we felt, than to just go 20 years prior.
And you mentioned also earlier on that you've incorporated your own experience and your own sort of childhood, sort of maybe 12-year-old self or whatever, into this series. What have you brought of yourself into this story?
So, for the Williams family and for their stories and their experiences and their points of view and the things that happen in their world, I'm pulling both from my own personal stories, but also from stories of my mom and dad, who the Bill and Lillian character are kind of loosely based on, but also my aunts and uncles, because they were the ones who were actually of age or coming of age during that time. Now, I was born in 72, so I came of age later. So the things that I'm pulling from my own personal experiences are those more universally relatable adolescent experiences that we all, kind of go through during those times of our lives, independent of race or, or background and things. Things like, your friendship issues, figuring out who your identity is in terms of in your friends and at school, your first crush, learning how the world works, dealing with the aspirations and then dealing with failure for the first time. All those sorts of things, I think, are the universally relatable parts of the character in the show that transcend everything. And so that's what I'm pulling from my own personal experiences to supply the stories. But then the specifics of that time period and the dynamics that would have existed only in that time period, I'm pulling from my aunts and uncles and stories I've heard about when they were growing up and things like that they've shared.
Oh, that's nice. And we're an Emmy Awards website at Gold Derby. We love our awards. And in 1988, The Wonder Years won Best Comedy Series for its first season after just airing six episodes. Right. Yeah. And it upset. It was a show, like it upset. It was sort of like viewed as by many Cheers versus the Golden Girls.
Right.
And The Wonder Years came up and won it. And it's funny. We've got the book here on the Emmys, and it talks about how 30-something won drama series. And a lot of people sort of said, or some people coined that it was sort of 12-something won the comedy series award. So many years later, and you've touched on this a little bit already, but what is still relevant about this type of story and world?
It's a good question, because TV has certainly changed a lot in those 30 some years, and in some ways it's come back full circle too, and as we try to figure out the way this series can appeal to the broadest audience, we do have to ask ourselves, about the as you said, the point of view of it, and and how it's relevant now. I mean, I think like I mentioned before, the experiences of coming of age and adolescence and the growing and the figuring out who you are in the world and how you fit into the world, I do think that's still relevant. I think those are timeless experiences that are part of our human condition, especially when you talk about American culture, right? That transcends race. But again, like we said, in terms of the social issues, I think it is unfortunately ironic that a show set in 1968 is still very relevant in terms of social issues, because we are still grappling with the exact same things in some ways that we were then. When I say that in terms of, America's place in the international community, how involved are we going to get into foreign wars? Those sorts of things are literally going on right now. The shift of power between the two parties in the presidential election, same thing that we've experienced recently. Women's issues, gender issues, were very prevalent then. It was the beginning of movements then. Now it's the resurgence of movements in terms of gender and identity and things. So the show is very relevant because of that. It's just in an ironic way. And it's unfortunate that we still have these same challenges in the society that we're dealing with. But, and I've said this before, if we can look back at the late 60s and that time and call those the wonder years, right? Because of the nostalgia attached to it, even though the late 60s were, if not just as tumultuous as now, more tumultuous, then that means 20 years from now, my kids will look back at this point and say this was their wonder years, right? And it's hard for us to imagine that now because how crazy the world is. But if that's the case, then I think there's benefit to seeing how we handled those things in the past so we can make sure we do it again this time.
You wrote the pilot. Was there a particular line that you think was like very important to get right in putting together that script?
There were a few lines that I felt carried a lot of weight, and I wanted to make sure that they were, structured in a way that could support that weight. Some of it was just the things that I wanted to culturally resonate with people who were of that time, or people who grew up a certain way in Black families, things like stay out of grown folks' business, and things like that. That had to be used in the right way. Or certain moments like when the Lillian character wants to give her family like an ashy elbow and an eye burger check before they go out because it was so important for Black families to represent themselves a certain way. But then Dean's speech, when he tells his mom and dad why this baseball game means so much to him, where he says, he feels different everywhere he goes, and he knows he'll always be different, and that he finds himself surrounded by friends who are different, racially and things like that. And when they all feel different, he feels like everybody else for the first time. I really wanted that to be something that came across because to me, that was a moment that captured Dean in his full 12-year-oldness, that was such a 12-year-old point of view, but it also reflected what was going on in society at large at that time too, in terms of for the first time, Black people and white people, post desegregation, having to figure out who they are together, and so that's one that I really wanted to make sure it came across both, context and subtext.
You've got also you've worked in on other TV shows in the past. Isn't your first television show you've worked on? One of the shows you've worked on in the past was Psych.
Yes.
Which this show has allowed you to reconnect with Dooley Hill. What's that been like?
It's been great. Dooley's amazing. When they first approached me to reimagine the Wonder Years, and I came up with the take, and they allowed me to loosely base it on my mom and dad in terms of the parent characters. Dooley was the first person I thought of to play the Bill Williams character, and I'm so blessed that it worked out the way he was able to, because I want that character to be able to carry a certain level of gravitas and dignity and integrity that I think Black men carried themselves with in the late 60s and early 70s. We don't see that represented a lot, but people who grew up during that time certainly recognize that and remember that. Black men dressed a certain way and carried themselves in public a certain way and kind of, took pride in certain things. And I knew Dooley had the gravitas to do that. Plus, I also knew Dooley as an actor could handle the comedy as well as the emotional moments, and the dramatic moments that I knew he wanted to touch upon at times. I knew they were going to be in really good hands with Dooley.
I'm meant to be interviewing him soon. Any good questions for him?
Let's see. Let me think. You can ask him. Ask him about the fact that Bill Williams' character is a musician, and if that's been a stretch for him to embody a musician and things that he has done to make that feel authentic. I think he'll enjoy answering that.
Oh, I've written it down. I'll throw it at him. Finally, to finish off,
Yes.
I was just wondering, 1 year, all about learning, all about a lot of first time stuff. What have you learned through making this show?
What have I learned through making this show? A few things. I'm trying. It's kind of hard to figure out the biggest thing I've learned. I'll say this. TV is hard, and broadcast TV specifically in this day and age is very hard. It's hard to come up with a broadcast comedy that is compelling because of all the competition you have with streaming and cable, and the fractured audience. And trying to tap into something that they're going to respond to it's really hard. Broadcast TV finds itself, I think, in a very precarious situation these days. But what I've learned is, in order for something to really be successful, as the showrunner, as the creator, I take pride in what my vision was for the characters and the stories and being able to execute that. But, a show is not successful just based on the vision of the showrunner, even the execution of that vision by me. There are so many people, especially because it's a period piece and we're trying to tap into a reality of what life was like. There's so many people whose expertise is needed and has to mesh in just the right way for a show to have all the elements involved. And there's some obvious things that we all know. You have to have a great cast, or obviously great writing, of course. Directing, most people don't probably realize it when they're watching it, but that certainly helps. But all of our department heads, from costumes to our DP to production design, I mean, they are stellar. And it is certainly something where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and that's the magic that you can't plan for, that you can't recreate. And it's scary sometimes, because it's not something you can just calculate. But when it comes together, like I feel it has in our show, it is something that is bigger than all of us. So what I've learned, is a long way of answering your question, what I've learned is to let other people be great, and trust in their greatness as well, and that knowing that when you do that, the product will be great too. And that's hard sometimes as someone when you're labeled creator, that makes you think that you are responsible for creating and everything. But no, you have to let other people be great. Part of creating is creating an opportunity and creating the space for other people to do what they can do best.
Fantastic. Well, it's been wonderful chatting with you today. All the best of luck with the upcoming Emmy Awards.
Thank
and
you, man.
people watching this interview can go on to goldderby.com to make your own predictions.
Great. Thank you so much, man. It's my pleasure.
No worries. It was a pleasure.